we're going to take a look at the different types of monster reports that we may have. We're going to look at how we can control disparate data and how we can control disparate controls. When you get these reports that seem really big, you kind of step back and you get a little intimidated at times, but you shouldn't really be afraid of these because they're kind of like the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. Each time that we get one of these reports, if we take it just one section at a time, typically they're going to be fairly easy to get through. So our types of monster reports are going to be our disparate data, and this is a report that has lots of different types and sources of data that need to be organized and presented typically in just a table. They want one table and they want all kinds of things in it. A lot of times this is going to be like a month-end report where there's 20 other reports that they have you run that have all kind of detail, and they just want the summary information from those 20 reports consolidated onto one report. Now, the disparate controls is a little different. That's one where you've got lots of controls to present in an organized manner. A lot of times that will be multiple charts, multiple grids, and you're going to have to get them to line up and neatly present in the manner that they want them presented. So we'll take a look at different ways that we can handle this. For our disparate data, this is a report that combines the results of multiple data sets into a single table. In some cases, the row data differs in format from one result to the other. For those reports where you're getting the totals off of the bottom of the report, you may have one that is a 6-month report, you may have one that's a 12-month report, and you have to control how you're going to do that. So we'll look at ways that we can handle that. And this was a sample of one of the ones that I did. The details are blurred to present, to protect the guilty, mostly me. And you can see that we had data that was in one format here, another format here, and then here we've got generally the same format for everything, but somehow we end up with details that come under this. And we've got little icons out here that would allow us to bring up charts. So this was a massive report to have to get together. It turned out to be about 150 pages, which was something that they had to turn into the state on a monthly basis. Now, another type is our disparate controls. This is a report that combines the results of lots of small reports, commonly charts, into a single report. A lot of times these are referred to as dashboard reports. And this is a blurred sample of one of the dashboard reports that I ended up having to create for one of my other clients. These two reports were presented to me within 2 weeks of each other. So I was a busy camper there for a while. Some of the things that we need to overcome when we deal with disparate data is special ordering that they may require for information that's being brought in. Usually there's a natural order that data would be displayed, and a lot of times they don't want it in that natural order. They want it all mixed up because the state's dictated it that way, or that's the way the CFO wants it. There's always a reason, but there's special ordering that needs to be dealt with. The other thing is dealing with multiple row formats. You saw where we had different numbers of columns across the page for different data sets that were coming back. Sometimes you're going to have additional charts that may be part of a certain data set that you're adding to the grid, to the table. Other times you may have additional columns. So we need to be able to find a way of getting that presented to the user in a good way. The other thing that I ran into with this report is they wanted tooltips, but tooltips there's a special issue involved with tooltips because they wanted to be very verbose in what they were presenting as their tip. And what I found is that tooltips don't format themselves very well. If you've got a very long tooltip, it'll just go off the side of the page and they won't be able to see anything if they're reviewing the report. So we had to do some things to go ahead and format those. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Again, this was a sample of the disparate data. One of the things that I found allowed me to manage what went into my tables was to create a control table. And this is a table that you create in SQL, usually specific to the report that you're working on. Sometimes it's something that you can make more generic if you've had to do a lot of these reports, but usually it's going to be specific to this report. It allows the maintenance of the control information about groups of data on the report. Now this was a sample of the control table. It's a part of the control table that was used for the sample that I was showing you earlier. You can see that I had a category, and this was what got presented in the header of the category that was being displayed. This gave me the ability to order them in the way that I wanted them. Then I was able to define a group label, a group order, and I could tell it what type it was. And I used my type to define what format I was going to use on the report. And I would hide certain lines if the format was not the same as that line. So this had to match up to the information I did in my properties on my report lines. My grouping told whether I put a grouping at the end of the grouping for under the category. I also made a point of putting the source field name and source table name to let them know where I got the data from. So anyone who came behind me was able to go out and manage the report a little better. Then for the tooltips, because the long string didn't work well, I had them break it where they wanted it, and I believe we had 5 lines for what they were doing because they were being very verbose. And in this case, I'm showing 3. I also included a chart name which allowed me to fire off any of the charts that were associated with the icons that you saw on the side of the report. So let's take a look at let's go into a demo. We had technical difficulties getting started, so I've got the stuff up. It's just not as ready as it usually is, so let's see where we can go with this without taking up too much time. We're going to first look at our disparate data report, which in this case is a listing of the stats from our report server. And you can see that we've got all reports, then we've got reports by status, by source, by request type, by format. We've got our counts over here for each of those reports for the time period that we've defined. And then I've got my top 10 reports by the number of times run, by average duration, by average size in kilobytes, then average number of rows of data. So let's go out and take a look at the data now so that you've got an idea of what we're looking at there. And let me see if I can find the right one here. So in here, instead of having a control table, because I'm trying to give all of this to you within the RDL only, I've got my control table set up as a CTE. Normally this would be a table. I would usually label it RPT and then give it CTRL and then the name of the report. But for expediency's sake, for delivering this information to you, I've gone ahead and put it into a CTE. So we see that I've defined my total, which was my first header that you saw. And then we've got my other information. Now I've got total is my grouping category. I've got a grouping label. And then I've got the category order for each of my categories. Then I end up with my CTE for my counts. Now, we talked about this being multiple data sets. What I've ended up doing here is I'm able to do everything in one data set because I've got all the same columns for each of these. So you'll see that I've got my select for my totals, then I union, select for my status and union, select for my source union. This allowed me to do it one piece at a time. So I wasn't overwhelmed with having to do everything all at once. I could add one, I'd add it to the control to my control table, and then I would add the script for the data set in the report. It's the stored proc itself. So again, we handled this doing one bit at a time. So if we go to our report and we look at it again, we can say, okay, well, what can we do to make this a little bit different? Now, I got to thinking about it, and I said, well, you know, if I color-coded the different types of categories I'm dealing with, that might make things a little easier for the user. So I went ahead and created a second one, and this is what it ended up looking like. If we go out to our data for that one, when we look at our control table, and I'm not going to bother running this, you'll see that I've added a background. Typically, this would be a new column that got added to my control table in the database. Anytime that you needed to add something that allowed you to decide how something was going to be handled on the report, you add a new column to that control table. And as you work through this, some of the time that control table will get fairly complicated. So how we handled this in the report is we came out here to our header and then went over to properties, which I got the label. There we go. So my background color is now being populated through my expression. And what I've done is I've just pulled that background value from my data set that came back. So here's the fields that got brought out. I've got the counted, the category order, and my labels, and then I've got my background color. So make sure we've covered everything we need. So that's generally all I wanted to say about the disparate data for the moment. So we're going to look at disparate controls, and some of the things that we need to overcome with that, the challenges that come with that, are the different size charts, gauges, and grids that may be requested for a report. We also need to make sure that we've got control of our data. Where are we going to get our data from? Is it going to be from a sub-report? Are we going to pass parameters from the base? Are we going to have to use a data set? And I typically look at all of this as Lego blocks when I start dealing with disparate controls, because I need each piece of that already built. So I need each of my Lego blocks that I'm going to be putting on that control, the dashboard that I'm building. So in this case, I've got, different reports that got created for each of these, and each one by itself was not much. Putting them together could be a challenge. So there's two approaches that I've used through the years. The first seemed to be the simplest, and that was creating a table, and the table would contain calls to sub-reports. There are some challenges involved in that, and I encountered a few today with rebuilding some of the information for this particular machine. The other is to build everything on the base report. And again, there are some challenges with that, but there are some ways that we can get around it. With our disparate controls, we need to pre-build those controls if we're going to do a good job of this. And each one of those will be its own standalone report. By doing that, you have a solid foundation of things that you can put together without having to worry that whether it's going to work when it gets to the final product. I found that if I keep my control width consistent, then I avoid a lot of issues down the road. You may have different widths involved, but typically you can keep wider ones about the same width and narrower ones their width. And again, each control is usually fairly simple to build. We just have to make sure that we do each one as it's standalone. Make sure it works first and then move on to the final build. When we do tables containing calls to sub-reports, there's a couple of issues that I've encountered with this approach. The first was that different size controls left gaps on the report. It was real easy to line things up across the page because my columns were very neatly laid out within the table grid. But if I had one control that was really tall and another control that was really short, I couldn't see the next row of controls until that tall control was completed. The other issue I ran into is that if you had a number of sub-reports that were being called that use the same parameters, some of the time those parameters did not work all of the time. I ran into the issue earlier tonight and said, okay, well, here's a good example. I'll go ahead and use my parameter set, the data set that I created. And when I went back and reran it a little later, it worked fine using the original parameters. You just never know. The big thing with doing sub-reports is that your sub-reports have to be published to the report manager before you publish the base report that contains more than one sub-report. And they have to be in play before you put the main report out there. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the reports I have out there for the disparate controls. This is what our final report is going to look like. So you can see that we've got reports by day of week, by day of month, the top 10 consumers and the top 5 folders. And then I've got this grid down the bottom that's got some of the information that we had from our stats. Now, if I come up to my first run, I'm showing statistics that I want to see. And this is what would go in that center grid. Now, this is my first attempt. This is going ahead and I've created a table and I've put each of my sub-reports in here. Now, let's step through that process just in case. You do a right click, you go down to Insert, and you do Sub-Report. And you get this blank sub-report in here. So we're going to come in here, now we populate our sub-report properties. And we come here, this was the day of week, and I have to go ahead and do my parameters. So for my parameters, I've got a start date, and I can pull that from my start date parameter listing. Then I've got end date, and again, end date from my parameter values. And I go ahead and click OK. So if I go ahead and preview this, we can see that my statistics report, which was a very long report, had to finish up before we saw our next set of charts. Now, one way to get around this is to go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to break this grid into 2 different grids, which is what I ended up doing for this. So I see that reports by request is where this ends up, and probably this is going to be a pretty reliable place to stop. If I go down to reports by format, I'm going to get a big gap here. So I'm going to go ahead and just come out and deal with it by request. So I've gone ahead and created my stats by my report stats 1 and 2, which contain the data through request types and starting with format types. So we're going to come up here, we're going to change our properties, and we're going to go to report stats 1. Make sure our parameters are in place and say OK. Again, I'm going to insert another one for my report stats 2. So now I've got that in place. I can go ahead and do my preview again. And now we can see that everything kind of lines up the way we want it. It's still not quite as reliable as I've had with other methods, but it does work well if you follow all the rules and no one goes out and replaces one of your sub-reports without relaunching everything. That is one of the things that has to be done, or you end up with issues. Now, the other way that we've talked about doing it is to go ahead and put everything on the base report. And that's what I've done here. And all I did for this is I went out to each of my controls that I created. I went ahead, clicked on it, did a copy, and then just pasted it onto my report. So you can see that everything just got pasted on here. If I go ahead and do my preview now, I end up with the same issue that I ran into with my subreports. In this case, it actually went to a second page. So, this didn't quite work the way I'd hoped. But I found that if I went ahead and took my controls and placed them in rectangles, you can see that I've got a rectangle that goes around everything on this side. If we go out to properties, you can see that I've got a rectangle 1, I've got a rectangle 2, which is my center grid, and it will stretch as much as it needs to. And then I've got a rectangle 3 for my far right. And in this case, by putting everything in there, each rectangle handled my vertical sizing within itself and allowed the others to float within where they were. The one thing I needed to make sure with this is that I lined all my tops up so that they started in the same location so that nothing got out of whack here. Now, even with, I forgot one thing back on the stub reports. We discussed it, but we didn't go into what I ended up having to do. If I find that my data is not presenting, but it worked well when it was an independent chart or report, a lot of times it's because the parameters did not reach the report properly. So I always create a parameters data set that just goes out and queries my parameters. And it's just a real simple, at start as start date and at end date as end date, so that when I come out and I work with my parameters on my report set, I can come out and do my function here, and instead of using my parameter fields, I come down to my data sets and select my data set columns. And this has worked reliably to making sure that those parameters came through. I have at times I had one report that had, I think, 20 different sub-reports. It was a complicated one from the LPGA, and I had 3 or 4 of these parameter data sets. So we've looked at adding sub-reports, we've looked at passing parameters, we've worked through avoiding gaps in our controls. We went through our base report. Now, the issues that I've encountered with the base report is that all data sets must be defined in the main report. So even though you've defined your data set on that report that if you were doing from the sub-reports was a sub-report, you copied that base report over onto you copied the control over onto the base report, you still have to have the data sets defined on that main report, because when you did that copy over, it did not bring the data sets. And then we saw the gaps with the multi-size controls. Let's go ahead and take a look at the data sets and how that had to be dealt with. We're going to go to report 3, which was our base report, And you can see here that I've got my parameters that I had set up previously, and then I've got my data set for each of my controls that are out there, my day of week, day of month, the center stats report, as well as the top 10 and top 5. Without these being here, these reports would not render, or the controls would not render. But by handling that properly, again, if I wanted to get the gaps resolved here, I would end up putting two reports here. I would remove this one by clicking delete. I would go out to report stats 1. Do a control C, and then come back here and paste it. And at this point, I need to get it mostly lined up with these guys at the top, and I need to come back and grab its data set. And when I come back here, I'll paste it in here. And at this point, I always want to test out, make sure I've got it pretty much where I want it. So I know that that one's where I want it. So I come back to my design. I go to report stats 2. Now, one of the things that I just saw is I need to rename this so that it doesn't conflict with what I've already done. And we're going to do a preview of this just to make sure we're getting what we think we get. Then I'm going to come out and do a copy, go back to report 3. And this time, when I paste it in here, I'm going to line it up with the top of these 2 reports, or controls. Now, I do need to come out here and add a data set, and this one's going to be DS report stats 2. And if I come out here, I can grab that. Minus the parameters. Paste this in here, refresh my fields. Refresh. Okay. So at this point now, when I do a preview, hopefully everything comes in table 2 refers, and I thought we got. See if I fat fingered something. And there we get everything that we want to get. So at this point, we went ahead and talked about our data sets being in place, and we've worked around the reporting gaps by using our rectangles. That's about all I have for tonight. I went through this fairly quickly because of all the technical issues that we had up front. Detailed information about this can be found in my blog at sqlpamwordpress.com. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can either email me. If you mention me on Twitter, it gets to me. If you mention what you want, I'll see if I can get back to you. My user group website is hillsborough-sqlpass.org. And that's about all I have tonight, unless someone has some questions for me.
We don't have any questions at this point. Don't be shy.
Can I get a number of how many people are going to be attending Summit?
I have a question. It says, how is performance for the dashboard report?
It took a lot of optimization because there are a lot of times where you're hitting the same data multiple times, and it took a lot of being able to get in there. The information that the data sets that you're getting from me, the scripts for that are not as optimized as I've had them in the past. Since I originally wrote this presentation, which was back in using 2005, it was before the 2008 came out, all of my data sets were geared towards 2005. There was a major change in the report server views between 2005 and 2008, and I'm anticipating another major jump between 2008 and 2016. So when the 2016 comes out, I'll go ahead and see about getting additional scripts out there for that. I know that my DBA said that he needed to optimize some of the data out there to be able to run these more efficiently, because they're averaging almost 100,000 reports a day on their report server.
Another question that we have is, what is the difference in pass-through report and sub-reports? Which is better to use in terms of performance?
Whenever you do a sub-report, it's having to render everything all at once. If you pass a report, say you click on something to bring up that, like a drill through report, it renders that new report at the time that you request it. It's not rendered prior to that. So you don't have that performance hit at the time until you actually want it. But there will be a lag at the time you click on it to get the past report. Now, those reports that were built on the base report, where I did the copy of my report onto the base report, that has a little better performance because I was able to, in some cases, tweak what I was dealing with there in in that big report that had the disparate controls, there were several of those controls that used the same data set. It was just kind of tweaked a different way from one time to the other. So I was able to use the same data set for multiple controls, and that worked well. I wasn't hitting the same data 3 and 4 times. It just utilized it 3 or 4 times.
Another question, will putting a sub-report in a rectangle get around headers misalignment when they are over each other?
It should. I've not tried using the sub-reports inside rectangles. It's just not something I'd tried, because normally your table defines a lot of what you need for that. But it would, I think that would. It is an option. But again, your rules of sub-reports, of making sure that the reports are already deployed on the report manager, is critical. If you don't have those sub-reports out there before you deploy the report that uses them, you're going to end up having issues. What I had was somebody went out and corrected a spelling error on one of my sub-reports, and he just downloaded it, made an edit to it, and then redeployed it, and then suddenly nothing was working. A large chunk of the report disappeared. And when I went out, I found that this person had gone out to help me out. He just didn't know the rules, and as a result, suddenly half the report disappeared. So it is critical that anyone dealing with Report Manager understands that if it's a sub-report, it does need to be handled with care.
Another question, since SSRS 2016 is HTML5, does it mean we can expect Android or iPhone apps for SSRS to complement Power BI?
I haven't heard one way or the other on that. My source tells me that I should expect some new controls to go into some of your charting controls. They've enhanced some of those, and they've added some new ones, is what I've been hearing. I'm not sure if they're going to make that Android, iPhone compatible. I believe it's one of the things that was requested frequently, so it may be there, but that's more of a hopeful on my part, not necessarily somebody told me it would be there.
Okay. What is your thoughts on using stored procedures as query type instead of text?
Oh, I probably should have said that up front. I always, one of the first things I do when I go into a client site, if they have their reports as inline text for their data sets, the first thing I usually do is convert that to stored procedures. When I do a presentation and I'm delivering an RDL, delivering stored procedures with that becomes problematic. So it's easier to go ahead and deliver that data as in the data sets as inline SQL. It is not the way I would suggest you code. Stored procedures allow your report server data engine to go out and optimize a lot easier than the inline SQL. So it's always going to be faster to use stored procs. I mean, that's just hands down. Like I said, the only reason these are inline SQL is for ease of delivery to you.
Okay, I think we don't have any more time for more questions. So thank you everyone for your questions, and I want to take this time to thank Pam for her time and her expertise. We'd like to also thank our sponsors, Microsoft, Itera, and Dell Software, as well as Pyramid Analytics, SQL Sentry, and HP. Stay tuned for our next session, Hadoop Essentials for the SQL Server Professional with Bill Prichuk, happening in a few minutes. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.